In fact, everyone who is an adult, mature, healthy, functioning person, in fact, does have a philosophy. And the question is whether your philosophy is going to be thought out and reflective, or whether your philosophy is just going to be adopted from watching television commercials and seeing TikTok videos and whatever.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Kaczor. He is Professor of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and his work has focused on bioethics, theology, and more. His books include, among many others, The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice. The third edition of that will be out next month. Disputes in Bioethics, Abortion, Euthanasia, and Other Controversies, and several others. He also has a variety of published articles on these issues. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Kaczor.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So yeah, today we planned on just focusing our discussion on the topic of abortion, which is a big topic, very controversial. But yeah, I like to approach these things as you do, I think, from a philosophical angle. And I'd like to, talk a bit about that. So one of the major issues, it seems, when talking about the ethics of abortion is surrounding the notion of person or personhood. And the main idea being that, look, persons or those which have personhood have some right to life or moral value or something of that nature, given which it's wrong, or at least generally wrong, to kill them. That's the main idea. So is this a key part of your approach to the issue, that this is sort of central in the debate to you? Or maybe you could just start by giving your main thoughts on that.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of discussion about personhood in the literature on abortion. And you have various defenders of abortion defending various views about what exactly personhood consists in. So there's really no consensus, you might say, on the pro-choice side about it, what exactly constitutes a person. My own work does talk about personhood, but I don't think you need the concept of a person to think through the issue of abortion. I think that Don Marquis's argument about a future like ours, which doesn't take a stand on fetal personhood, is a persuasive argument to look at. But we can certainly talk about those issues of personhood and what counts as a person and the various views that have been expressed on that topic. But I'm not sure that you need it in order to have an informed view about the ethics of abortion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something I was sort of thinking about, which is that, look, even if a fetus does not fall under this category of a person, it still remains a question whether it would be right to kill them. Maybe they fall under some other category, say, I don't know, sentient life or something capable of feeling pain, that sort of thing, given which it might be wrong to kill them, or they might have a right to life. So
I think that's right. I mean, for instance, you could have a very strong animal rights view, right, where you say that all animals are equal and all animals have a strong right to live. And if you had that view, I think you can make an argument on biological grounds that the human zygote, the human fetus, the human newborn are all animals of some kind. And if all animals have the basic right not to be killed intentionally, well, then it would follow that the human zygote, the human fetus, and the human newborn would fall under that kind of argument. So I do think the personhood category has been involved a lot in the abortion debate. And I do, in my books, talk about various accounts of what a person is. And as you may know, in the abortion debate, there's been a lot of rival views put forward. So you have people like Peter Singer saying, advocating a kind of Lockean view of the person, where the human being wouldn't become a person until after birth. And Giuliani and Minerva have this sort of view too, that human beings become persons after they're born, when they have a conception of themselves and they desire to continue living. Now, human beings gain that conception of themselves at around the age of 2. That's when most human beings can pass the so-called mirror test. And that's where you put a little mark on someone's forehead and they encounter a mirror. And then if they recognize themselves as themselves and they say, well, what's on my forehead, or they touch their forehead, that's indicative of self-awareness. Whereas, say, a dog passing a mirror will think it's another dog and, attack or play or do whatever, but they think it's another dog. So human beings on average gain that ability around the age of 2, and some human beings later, of course, mentally delayed, mentally handicapped human beings, but on average around the age of 2. So on Giuliani and Minerva's view, it would be only at that point that the human being would become a person. There's a bunch of other views, but my own view is that basically all these rival views that have been put forward fail for a variety of reasons, and that we ought not to exclude any human beings from the category of personhood.
Right. One concern that I've had, and I think your co-author on your 2017 book, the title of which is, Abortion Rights For and Against. Kate Greasley made the point that the notion of person or personhood might be significantly vague. And so it might be, there might just be no fact of the matter of where the line between person and non-person is in some cases. What do you think about that view and maybe the relevance that might have to this disputes over abortion?
Well, I would say in matters of fundamental justice, when you're talking about who is able to be killed lawfully, that vagueness and arbitrary lines are not a very suitable way of demarcating those human beings that have basic human rights and those human beings that don't. So there's something vague and arbitrary about deciding, well, it'll be 16 years of age when you drive. But that obviously is not a life or death matter. No one's getting put to death if they are 15 and a half. So by contrast, in the ethics of abortion and infanticide, you literally are talking about life and death matters. So I don't think it's going to do to have a vague, arbitrary standard of who counts as a person and who doesn't count as a person. Rather, I think we need, as much as possible, non-arbitrary and clear standards for who would count as a person and who would not.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I guess my thought is that the sort of concept or the term as we're now using it just is vague. We could, conceptually engineer it in such a way that we have some precise definition. I would say that that's, a matter of stipulation or adopting a more precise linguistic convention, maybe. And maybe we could use that for the purposes of drawing some boundary here. But then the question would be, well, there's just endless ways we could do that. Like there's many different non-vague lines to draw. Then the question would be, which one would we choose? If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that's exactly part of the reason why I reject the idea that there are some human beings that are not persons. Every time we've drawn vague, arbitrary lines that differentiate human beings that are persons from those that aren't, we've made a catastrophic error. Think about all the times in history when we've said of some class of human beings, oh, you're black. You don't really count fully as a person. You're only, as the Supreme Court once decided, 2/3 of a person. When we did this with Native American people, when we've done this with any other group of human beings, we look back on that and say that that is a catastrophic error. And so, on my view, what we should do is have an ethics of inclusivity. We should say every single human being, no matter how old, no matter how young, no matter if they're disabled, if they're healthy, if they're sick, all human beings deserve basic human rights, basic human consideration. And so we shouldn't engage in arbitrary line drawing exercises where we say, well, you count and you don't count. Because I think if we learn from history, we'll see every single other time we've ever done that kind of division of humanity into those that count as having basic rights, basic dignity on the one hand, and those that don't. Every single time we've ever done that, we have made a catastrophic mistake.
Yeah, so I do want to touch on a few things there. I'll turn to the kind of moral question in a second. What if someone were to say, maybe that's true that we have made these catastrophic mistakes in the past, but I mean, at best, that's some sort of inductive reason to think that this would be a mistake as well. And there's also relevant differences between those cases and this case. Those cases typically involved already born human beings, and this case doesn't. I mean, you might say, is that a relevant difference? Well, that's a matter of debate, I suppose. I don't know. What do you think about the sort of replies that I'm gesturing at here?
Well, I think you're right. There's obviously differences, and there's differences among all these cases, right? In some cases, you'd say, well, this person differs in terms of the color of their skin, or you might say this person differs in terms of their religion, or this person differs in terms of being from Europe. And there's all kinds of differences. So there's whatever historical case you use will, in some respects, be different than others. What's relevant, it seems to me, isn't those differences, but what they have in common. And what they have in common is those in power say, if you're like me, white, European, male, whatever the characteristic is, if you're like me, well, then you deserve basic rights and then you have dignity. If you're different than me, well, you really don't. You have the exact same dynamic here. If you're like me, if you're born, well, then you count. If you're not like me, you don't. And appealing to birth, I think, is completely arbitrary. We don't generally count basic human rights or an immunity from getting intentionally killed to all creatures that are born. I mean, rats are born, dogs are born, cats are born. Very few people think they have a strong right to live. So the idea that birth somehow magically transforms a mere human being who has no value at all into a person that has full moral status, it seems to me completely arbitrary and not borne out by at least most people's views that it's not the case that being born grants you personhood. Very few people grant, again, rats full personhood to us, even though rats are also born.
Right. But you could say the same thing about rats at conception. We don't think that they have full personhood then. But what if someone were to say that the sort of moral value or rights that something has can also be sort of vague or gray, or sort of rely on some sort of kind of continuum, so to speak, and it's not necessarily that just upon some hurdle they go from having no or little value or right to life to having full right to life. So maybe it's like none or very little at conception, and then pretty much full at birth. What do you think about that sort of view?
Yeah, that's sometimes called the gradualist view or the developmental view. And you're right. The basic idea is something like at conception, the individual in question has almost no worth or value and can be killed for any reason. And then maybe early in pregnancy, as the human being is more developed in utero, it has a little bit of value, but that's easily overridden. And then maybe you might say in the third trimester of pregnancy, when a baby could be born and live independently, well, then it has more value, and abortion would only be permissible in a very serious situation, let's say. And then you might say at birth, the individual in question has full moral status. Now, that is a view that some people hold. I don't find that view very plausible for a number of reasons. One is that we don't generally link up the physiological or physical development of a human being with that individual's worth. We don't generally say, well, you really are a full status human being, and it really becomes wrong to kill you when you're 25 because you're, fully grown in height and you're, more mature and your prefrontal cortex is developed, et cetera. And so there's a serious difference then between killing a 25-year-old human being and killing, let's say, an 8-year-old human being. you say, well, it's not that bad to kill an 8-year-old since they're not really fully developed. But if you kill a 25-year-old, well, that's really very seriously wrong. So we don't tend to think that our development is linked in this way with our physiology or our psychology. The second reason, though, I think this kind of argument doesn't work is that if you think about, you can make an argument something like this. If you have one thread, it's sort of easy to break. If you have two or three threads, well, it becomes a little harder. And if you keep on adding thread after thread, eventually you get a rope that's hard to break. And if you keep on adding threads, you get a very, very big, strong rope, and that's extremely hard to break. And you might, by analogy, say, look, at conception, it's like a little thread, very easy to break. And then as you add various characteristics, it gets stronger and more difficult to break until eventually it's like this big, strong rope. But the trouble I have with this is that I don't think the threads have any real value in terms of establishing personhood or establishing our right to live. So I just mentioned that birth seems completely irrelevant, and so yes, you'd say and I think for reasons we can talk about, that viability is also completely irrelevant to our moral status, our personhood. For reasons we can talk about, I think sentience is completely irrelevant for our moral status and personhood. So to add, sentience and birth and viability all together, well, that adds up to zero, right? Because an invalid, unsound argument is worthless. And if I add up 3 invalid, unsound arguments for moral status together, well, that's 3 zeros added up, which adds up to nothing. So I don't think the developmental view ends up really working. The developmental view is appropriate in some cases of rights. So think of the right to drive. It makes sense to say, look, we don't let 5-year-olds drive a car because 5-year-olds don't have the judgment and probably don't even have the physical abilities to safely drive a car. And to exercise the right to drive, we need to have the corresponding responsibilities in order to drive safely and keep everyone else safe. In a similar way with the right to vote, right? The right to vote, it makes sense to reserve that for more mature people, 18, let's say, because they can, look ahead and evaluate things. And having, a 5-year-old vote doesn't make sense because they're just too immature to really take into account things they need to take into account and exercise their right to vote in a responsible way. But by contrast, other rights, like the right to live, don't involve exercising responsibilities, or the right not to be enslaved, or the right not to be tortured. All these things are things, immunities, you might say, that don't come along with corresponding responsibilities, that I have to, exercise them in a certain way. So for that reason, I think it makes sense to say that some rights do come with age, that it makes sense to, have driving at 18 or drinking reserved, not allowed for 8-year-olds. That makes a lot of sense. But I don't think that same thing is true for what I'll call basic rights. So things like the right not to be intentionally killed, the right not to be tortured, the right not to be enslaved.
Yeah, good. I will say, a sort of full disclosure, at least my own preferences, leaving aside the question of what the moral facts and the rights are, probably follow something kind of close to this sort of developmental view. I tend to care more about things, especially humans, that have some of these features and have them to a greater degree, like sentience, capacity to experience certain sensations like pain and happiness and so on. And, as a result, I tend to care more about the survival of the unborn, the more they develop these capacities. And it's sort of vague, and I can't give a precise account of like what's informing my preferences here, but that's kind of on the reflection that I've done. That's kind of where I find it standing. Now, of course, it's a different question whether my preferences map onto the moral or like rights-based facts, right? That's a separate question, I think. But I don't know. But just broadly, what do you think about that? I mean, or is it just those are my preferences and that's it? I mean, do you think there's a
Well,
maybe a problem?
I would say that there is something to the view that as a human being develops, there's something increasingly wrong with intentionally killing that human being. And so what I'm thinking here of is the idea that very early in pregnancy, for me, it's very plausible that someone could say, hey, this is just a clump of cells. This is not even a human being. There's no way that this is even alive. Now, I think I think those views are mistaken. I think there's very good scientific grounds for saying that a living human embryo is actually a living human being. And so I don't think that's right, but I can see why someone would think this. On the other hand, let's say a week before birth, when the baby's kicking, and I think it's so obvious that this is a living human being that I think it becomes extremely hard to believe that someone could actually think that killing a human being, just a week before birth, really was just removing a lifeless clump of cells. Almost everyone has seen books like What to Expect When You're Expecting. Almost everyone's seen ultrasounds of babies in utero. And so, again, I think in terms of assessing the plausibility of thinking that this is just a lifeless clump of cells, I think that becomes extremely implausible, especially as time goes on. And I also think there's some plausibility to the idea that when a human being looks more and more like a newborn baby, our instincts kick in to a greater and greater degree. I mean, we wouldn't be alive as a species unless there was a very strong instinct that human beings have to care for helpless newborn babies. I mean, if we reacted to them the way we react to, I don't know, insects or something, I doubt we would have cared for newborn babies. And then, of course, the human race wouldn't have survived, right? Because newborns require adults to take care of them. Human newborns would all die unless they had people taking care of them. So I think instinctually there is, for evolutionary reasons, an enormous inclination, you might say, to find babies cute and adorable, and to be horrified with, babies getting killed, and be upset by babies screaming and crying. And again, I think that's part of the evolutionary package that enabled us as human beings to continue to survive. So it makes perfect sense to me that on an instinctual level or a kind of emotional level, it's more upsetting to see, a newborn baby killed, or a very late term abortion, as opposed to, very early, where it doesn't really look very much like a baby. But I don't think that how a human being looks is actually morally determinative of that human being's value. So think about how there are some human beings who look extremely disfigured. Think of someone who's been a victim of a fire, and maybe their face is totally burned up and they're missing limbs and they're just charred and they look very, what would you say, not very attractive. I would say that human being, even though they look really revolting, has completely equal moral status to the most attractive person on planet Earth. I don't think our moral status depends on other people's emotional reactions to it. And so, for the same reason, I think that our emotional reactions, for instance, to newborn babies, is understandable and normal, but I don't think that's determinative of who does and who does not have a basic moral status.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned there was the week before birth, say, or at least week before expected birth, or even hour before. You might wonder, or even during or post, in the case of, what some people will say. If there's a kind of morally relevant difference there, it seems to me that it's not going to be something kind of intrinsic to the unborn, to the fetus, but it'll have to be something to do with its relation to the mother or something else like that. Because what are we saying? Are we saying that it's like 1 week more of development is making that much of a difference? No, it's got to be something to do with, if anything, the connection with the mother. And then people bring stuff up like the violinist analogy, although this is a bit different because we're already granting that, you've been hooked up for like over 8 months or whatever. So, yeah. What do you think about the response that, well, there's not really much difference in terms of the fetus itself. This relying on the connection to the mother is some morally relevant difference there.
Yeah. So I think the connection to the mother is morally relevant. And on my view, biological fathers and mothers have very serious responsibilities for their own minor dependent children. So if I conceive a child, and I would say that as a biological father, I have a very serious responsibility to care for that child, and a very serious responsibility to try to nurture that child to full development. And that's true whether or not I wanted to become a father, whether or not I used contraception, whether or not the woman promised me she would get an abortion if she got pregnant. It's true regardless of all those factors. And I would say the same thing is true of a biological mother, that she too, like the biological father, has serious responsibilities to nurture that minor dependent son or daughter to maturity. And that would be true whether or not she used contraception, whether or not all the things that we just talked about. So I think you're right. There is a connection to the mother, and that is, I think, morally relevant, and that is a differentiating factor when you compare this to the violinist analogy. So in that analogy, as you know, you wake up attached to this unknown random violinist, and so if I woke up in that way, I would not have the same kind of responsibilities for this random violinist as I do have for my own minor dependent son or daughter. I have a very serious responsibility, I think, to help my own minor son or daughter, even at great personal sacrifice to myself, whereas I don't have the same responsibilities to a random stranger.
Right. So the big difference there is well, who you have these responsibilities toward. Um, and so you said if the violinist analogy were changed so that the violinists were, say, I don't know, your actual son or daughter, maybe they're an adult, um, that you would say the intuition behind the violinist analogy in the original case fails here, and you really do have that responsibility to remain hooked up to them. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, let me consider a different case that might make my point a little more clear. So let's say you have a couple that is an on again off and on again off again hookup relationship, and the couple meets each other up in the cabin, and she says, "Hey, I've got a big surprise for you, Sam. In the other room is your daughter, Elizabeth." And he's like shocked. He hasn't seen her in 11 months. He's like, what the hell? And, he's really upset. They have a big fight. And so let's say she leaves the cabin. She goes away. And during that time, there is a huge storm, and the road up there to the cabin is washed out. So the father, is stuck with his newborn daughter. Now, I would say that he has a serious responsibility to use his own body to support his infant daughter. He has a duty and obligation, both legally and morally, to feed the baby bottles, to change her diaper, to bathe her, to do everything that he needs to do to keep that child alive. And if people return to the cabin, months later, and the guy says, "Hey, look, I didn't take care of her. I just let her die because, after all, this is my body and it's my choice not to feed her a bottle, not to change her diaper, not to take care of her. And I'm really sorry about that. But, I am not a good Samaritan. I'm only a reasonably, what's Thompson's word? A normal Samaritan or something. I didn't go above and beyond the call of duty." Well, I would say that person has actually failed in a very, very serious way. In other words, if a man finds himself in that situation, and this is his own daughter, I think he does have a very serious responsibility to feed her and change her diaper and do everything he needs to do to care for her. And the fact that he's the only one around, and that no one else is in the cabin, that doesn't diminish his responsibility or take his responsibility away. That, in fact, intensifies his responsibility, right? If there were 10 people at the cabin, well, he would not be responsible alone to feed the baby, etc. He could, make sure that it happened, but he didn't have to do it himself. But if he's the only one around, yes, he is the one who has that responsibility. So you can see, obviously, how that applies to the case at hand.
Right. What do you think about the response? I think you've commented on this, that responsibilities like this are born out of various commitments and so on that we make, right? We don't have these responsibilities unless we make the relevant sort of commitments that would entail them. And, perhaps we make various commitments regarding our children, and perhaps we make them regarding the unborn as well, but maybe we don't. So what do you think about someone who rejects this sort of line of reasoning on those grounds?
Well, I think you're right that many of our commitments are made through our own choice and decisions. So, to take one example, I'm adopted. And so, when I was adopted, my own parents who adopted me chose to go to the orphanage and get me and bring me home. And so, I would say that they, in doing that, took on special responsibilities. But I'm not sure that's the only way we get responsibilities. I mean, think about all the deadbeat dads out there, right? They get a woman pregnant and woman gives birth, and they did not decide to, for instance, pay child support. The judge said you have to pay child support. And now that is a legal responsibility, but in my view, it's also a moral responsibility. I would say ethically, if a man fathers a child, he is doing something seriously wrong if he fails to provide child support payments for that child. And in fact, on my own view, the father has way more responsibilities than simply to send off a check. I think actually to be a semi-decent father, you ought to be involved in the child's life. You should, help the kid learn to ride a bike and swim and whatever else. I mean, I think being a minimally decent father involves an enormous amount of giving and helping and sacrificing for the well-being of your son or your daughter. And that it would be true whether or not, if you're a man, you used contraception, whether or not you wanted to become a father, whether or not whatever other circumstances you want to bring forward. So I guess I just reject this idea that all our duties and responsibilities only arise if we voluntarily take them on. I mean, if that were really true, you'd say, well, you have no responsibilities or obligations to your own parents. After all, you didn't choose your own parents, or to your siblings, or to your country. All those things seem to me quite reasonable responsibilities that we take on, not simply because we voluntarily chose, but because they're part of our natural obligations, you might call them.
Right. So there are natural or moral obligations which can go beyond or even conflict with the sort of commitments that we have. That's the idea there.
Well, the idea would be that not all of our ethical obligations are solely the responsibility, or solely the result, rather, of our own choice to take them on. So let me give you another example. Imagine today you walk out of your house and someone has left a newborn baby on your front step. I would say that you have a responsibility to ensure that that newborn baby gets proper, what would you say, is taken care of properly. So that could involve you taking the newborn baby to a fire station and dropping it off, or calling the police and saying, hey, somebody dropped off a newborn baby on my front step. But if you were to just close the door and say, well, tough luck for that newborn, I didn't decide to do this, and then the newborn dies of exposure, I would say you've done something very, very seriously wrong. Right? If there's a car accident and you're driving along and this person is in desperate need of help, is about to die, and you're just like, well, tough luck. I'm going golfing. I'm really busy. Sorry. I'd say you did something seriously wrong. So the point is just to say that I think there are many ethical responsibilities we have that are not simply the result of, I chose to take on this ethical responsibility. Now, obviously, there are other ethical responsibilities that are the result of us taking on the responsibility. If you choose to get married, I would say you have serious responsibilities to try to love your spouse. But do you have to get married? No. I mean, and if you choose not to get married, you don't have those same ethical responsibilities to your spouse. So yes, some of our ethical responsibilities arise because we choose to take on certain commitments. Fair enough. But there are other ethical responsibilities that arise simply because of the context we find ourselves in.
Right. So I did want to. This does lead into another topic, which is quite significant for me, which is like, how are we? I have difficulty making sense of some of these notions of responsibility and, moral rightness and so on. Of course, I agree in these situations that I would be, um, you know, motivated based on my own commitments to act in these ways. But I'm not even clear what people are saying when they say that we have some independent of that, we have some responsibility to um, act in those ways, or it would be like very wrong if we didn't. I'm not even clear what's being said there. Um, Maybe this isn't a very common response, but it's not clear to me. I'm not sure I even understand it. Um, do, do you sort of see where I'm coming from?
I don't think I do actually. So maybe you can say more. When you say you don't understand that, like if I say if you run across a newborn baby, you're out on a run or something, and you run across a newborn baby in the woods, totally alone. You know that there are wolves. It's sunset. Wolves will be out in the forest soon. Is the idea something like, well, I personally happen to have a commitment not to let newborn babies get eaten by wolves, but if somebody else is jogging and they're, intent on their workout, it wouldn't be wrong for that person just to let the baby be in the woods and get eaten by wolves that night. Is that the kind of view you're talking about?
No, well, no. I mean, I would still be very much against, or very much prefer that the other person act in more or less the same way that I do. Um, but all I'm saying is that I'm just talking about what my preferences are on these this and other cases. I might prefer that everyone act in more or less the same way that I do in that sort of similar situation. Other people might have different preferences. That would be disappointing to me. But I'm not sure what's being said when someone says, okay, leaving aside these preferences, because I mean, someone might not have those same preferences. It would still be wrong in some robust sense for them to leave the baby on the road, or in the woods, or whatever. That's the sort of claim that is not really clear to me. I can understand these claims about the various aims or preferences or whatever that I and other people have. There's all sorts of other claims that I can understand that we might use normative vocabulary to communicate. But some of these kind of robust realist notions like that, it's not clear to me what's being
Well,
said.
okay, so maybe I could be more clear. My idea is something like this. There are some things that are wrong independent of the preferences of those involved. So, for instance, I would say that to rape someone is objectively morally wrong, regardless of the preferences of the person who's thinking about doing the rape. So it doesn't depend at all on does he prefer this or not, or do most people prefer this or not. It's just independent of preferences that kind of action would be very seriously wrong. So I don't. So is your concern that's unintelligible or something? I don't. Maybe it is, but I don't quite see why it would be.
Yeah. So like when I say something like, "Well, rape is wrong" or whatever, normally what I'm saying is that just another way to say what I've just said is that rape is something that uh, I would very much prefer not to happen. It goes against my sort of stances regarding human action. Um, that I'm just communicating something about my own stances. Um, of course, I
Oh
might try to
yeah,
communicate other things with that language, and you might say,
yeah.
okay,
So
you can use the language that way, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, obviously, you can use language any way you like. It's your language, but it sounds like what you are expressing is a view called emotivism, right? That moral truths really are just expressions of your preferences or your emotions. And so when you say rape is wrong, that's like saying, "Boo, I really don't like that." And when I'm talking about moral claims, what I'm saying is it's not simply a matter of my emotions or your emotions or anyone's emotions, but rather it's something that's objectively true. So, yeah, I'm a moral realist. I'd say that certain things are objectively wrong, regardless of your emotions or my emotions. And so, for me, things in that category would be, raping someone. I would say that's objectively wrong. And it doesn't matter what my preferences are, or your preferences are, or my emotions are, or your emotions are. So, I guess we could have a discussion about whether emotivism is plausible or not. I find it extremely implausible, in part because the idea that the claim rape is wrong is the same kind of claim as a claim like, I hate when Notre Dame loses football games and I get really upset by it. Those seem like totally different claims. Things that I react to emotionally are just in a totally different category than basic moral truths. And so there are all kinds of things that I react emotionally to that are just distinct and really different than any moral claim whatsoever.
Yeah. For me, I don't share that. I mean, it is pretty similar to me. Maybe a difference in degree, um, but nevertheless, I recognize that my way of using the language here, maybe to communicate some attitude or stance that I have, might not be the norm. Maybe most people don't use it that way. Certainly, a lot of philosophers don't use it that way. And but then the question for me comes to, I don't really understand how a lot of other people are using it, especially the philosophers. Um, I can understand what people claim about moral realism. It's like, okay, it's cognitive. There's the stance independent. There's like some of them are true. Maybe we know some of them, that sort of stuff. But I've just never quite understood what it means to for something to be wrong in this sense, or in any sense,
Well,
because yeah.
okay, so maybe this might help a little bit, maybe not. On your view, when would there be things that are true independent of us? In other words, independent of our preferences and emotions. So, for instance, if I say to you, the interior angles of a triangle equal 180, or force equals mass times acceleration, would you say that that's just totally independent of your emotions, my preferences, your preferences?
Yeah, of course, there's objective facts.
Okay,
The sun
okay,
in the sky, that's not dependent on my attitudes or
okay, okay.
stances.
So then, what would be the problem with there also being objective facts in the moral realm? That, for instance, that racism is objectively wrong, that is not dependent on your emotions or your preferences or whether you're raised in the South or the North or whether it's just, in fact, objectively true for everybody that racism is wrong. Why couldn't that truth be in the same category along with force equals mass times acceleration?
Well, because well, at least for me, my notion of wrong that I'm using, or at least understand, it is one which just is stance dependent, right? It's just this notion which is um, uh, saying something about stances, real or hypothetical. And if clearly that's not the notion you have in mind, because then you'd be saying, well, there's these stance dependent, stance independent facts, and that's just incoherent. I don't understand the notion of wrong or reason or obligation or right or anything like that, where it's not this sort of stance dependent notion. Um, of course, there are some ways to use the terms that, kind of like someone could be some sort of analytic naturalist, and I could understand those terms in that way, and it could be stance independent. Um, but that's not the normal view, and I guess it wouldn't be my target of complaint, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. I mean, the view I'm defending though is a view it seems that is defended by a wide variety of different philosophical perspectives and perspectives that are totally compatible with naturalism. So, I mean, John Stuart Mill thought that there were ethical truths that are stance independent. Immanuel Kant thought that. Plato thought that. Aristotle thought that. So, the view I'm talking about is compatible with a lot of different naturalistic perspectives. So, I don't quite, in other words, naturalist is still.
Yeah, to be clear, I wasn't trying to say something like, well, if it's not naturalist, then I can't really understand it. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Certainly there. For example, if you could think that um, what it means to be good has something to do with you know divine commandments or something like that, I can understand that. That makes sense. I probably wouldn't use the terms in that way, but um, it's a usage that makes sense to me. The problem wasn't that it's non-naturalist. It's the problem is that um, well, like the analytic naturalist use is one that I can make sense of. I mean, of course, it's naturalist, but that's not the reason I can make sense of it. It's just, if they're identifying the good or a good action with one that promotes, I don't know, pleasure or something like that. I can understand what you're saying, but when someone just says no, it's, I mean, maybe promoting pleasure is a good, but what it means to be good is just, I don't know, some primitive notion. It's just good, you know. That is something I've never really understood. Maybe I'm just, could be that I'm missing some concept or failing to recognize that I have it. But yeah,
Yeah, so the view you're talking about sounds like the view of G.E. Moore, right? Who thought of good being a little bit like yellow, that you just sort of recognize it and there was no further analysis possible of it. So on my own view, if we're talking about the ethics of abortion, I'm not sure we need to determine all. In other words, these questions, while important and interesting, I don't think they're necessary for coming to conclusions about the ethics of abortion. Maybe that's wrong, but I think you can come to the same conclusion whether you had an Aristotelian view, a Kantian view, arguably even a utilitarian view, although that is a little bit harder, but I think still probably you could do it. Um, so I think the views I'm talking about are compatible with a variety of meta-ethical views, you might say.
yeah. But would it be compatible with um, the sort of thing that I've been talking about? I guess you could call it a sort of subjectivism. Maybe
Well,
this
no.
doesn't
I
look
mean,
quite right.
if a pure subjectivism is true, yeah, of course, abortion couldn't be wrong, but neither could racism, neither could condemning rape, neither could pretty much anything that almost everyone does condemn. So, yeah, if you had a purely subjectivistic or purely relativistic view, then yeah, there's nothing that's right or wrong. I mean, genocide, you can condemn that. You say, well, maybe you don't prefer to do genocide, but maybe somebody else does, and who am I to say that genocide's a bad thing? I find that view very implausible. But yeah, I mean, if you have a purely relativistic or purely subjectivist view, then yeah, there's nothing whatsoever that's wrong, including rape and racism.
Well, the thought is that what's wrong here, to say that something is wrong, at least as I'm understanding it, is to say something about some stance or attitude, be it mine, someone else's, or some hypothetical one that we might be considering. So, if I'm talking about myself, yeah, rape and genocide are wrong, and I'm as committed to that as uh, the most robust moral realist in terms of how it would inform my attitudes and my actions. Now, yeah, I guess I'm not committing to it being some robust objective fact, but I'm not making that commitment because I can't even make sense of what that commitment would entail, would involve. So yeah, I guess that's maybe I'm stuck there. I don't know.
Yeah, I would like to talk to you more about that, but I'm a little unclear. I mean, when you say, I'm just a little unclear on your view. So we can continue talking about your view if you want, or we can talk more about the ethics of abortion if you want. So either way you want to go, we can go.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about a couple other things on the ethics of abortion. Um, here's another thing I was thinking about, and this is sort of related to some of the concerns I'm having, but it's another issue. Suppose, let's ignore whatever concerns I'm having about the status of these moral claims. Suppose suppose it turns out that it is really immoral to really wrong to kill a fetus, um, you know, in normal circumstances. And there might be a further question of why would we be motivated to act in that way? You know, this connection. So people can ask about this question between the moral facts and more motivation. Maybe there's no kind of inherent connection there. Um, so, I mean, people might have the commitment to act in the moral way, but maybe they don't. I mean, what do you think about this concern?
So if I understood your question correctly, it has to do with, well, let's suppose for the sake of argument that abortion is wrong. Why should anyone care about that? Is that a way to summarize your question?
I guess it's close, although the why should anyone care might be asking another moral question. And you might say, well, we should care because we're obligated to care because that's the moral facts. But I guess the question I have in mind doesn't bake in something like that, but it's something more like, um, you know, why would we? Maybe we wouldn't care. Maybe I guess I'm looking for something that ties into our motivations for here for why we would do that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay, so I think that's a good question, and I think that there could be a variety of motivations that could cause someone to care about that. So, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So, I can imagine somebody saying, "Look, I care about justice, and so I care about abortion, I care about genocide, I care about all these issues that are all justice issues." You could have somebody who says, I'm somebody who tries to care for and love other people. And so I have a special concern for vulnerable, dependent human beings. And so I reach out and try to help those that are vulnerable and dependent. And I think it's fair to say that a infant or a human being in utero is very vulnerable and very dependent. And so people who cared about vulnerable, dependent human beings could be motivated to care about these individuals. You could have some people who are motivated by a kind of ethic of love. And this ethic of love might say something like, you should love everybody. Nobody is a nobody. And so you might say, look, there's a whole class of human beings that some people are marginalizing, some people are excluding, some people even want to kill. And so, because I try to love everyone and I try to care about everyone, I'm going to care for this class of human beings. So, you might be somebody like me who is adopted and who was himself the result of an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. And you might say, hey, I'm really glad that I'm here. I'm glad that I'm alive. And I think that other people who are in my same situation have an equal right to be alive. And presumably they're going to enjoy life just as I enjoy life. So you could have a kind of Kantian universalizability that if I were in that situation, I too would want legal protection. I too would want my own mother to be supported, and I would want to be protected by law and welcomed in life. So I think there's actually a number of different motivations that people might have for caring about this issue.
Yeah. So part of that is that, look, if this is, I think what you were saying initially, that maybe it's a sort of consistency check, right? If people have um, concern about rights in one area but not in another, well, what's making the difference there? Why do you care about one and not the other? What's the relevant difference? And the other thing might be that, well, caring about rights in some cases but not others might threaten rights, even in those cases where you care about them. If that makes sense, is that what you're getting at? Maybe. Uh,
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think that given human interest in human time, not everyone can have equal concern about every issue. So, for instance, if you think about drunk driving, there could be people who are very concerned about drunk driving because maybe it has touched them in a personal way. Maybe their brother was killed in a drunk driving accident. So they have a special care and concern about this issue because it's impinged on their own life in a very significant way. So I think there's room for a variety of concerns that some people might be just drawn to trying to combat drunk driving. Other people might be drawn to especially to caring about the environment because they love camping or something and they've really enjoyed the great outdoors. And then other people might be especially drawn to the abortion issue. Again, maybe because they're adopted, maybe because they know someone who's adopted, maybe because they themselves caused a crisis pregnancy or had a crisis pregnancy. And then they only realized after the baby was born what a beautiful gift human life is and how much that child enriched their lives. So it seems like there could be a whole variety of objective and also personal motivations that give rise to caring about this issue.
right. Good. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Did want to cover a couple other things as well. When talking about the sort of consistency check, recall one of the examples you gave regarding the violinist analogy, and we already talked about a variation or two already, but you gave this example where, okay, What if the violinist is attached to you, and they could swap you out for someone else, and if they did so, you would get killed. But they would prefer to be with this other person, be attached to this other person for the 9 months or whatever. And I think your thought here was something like, look, in this case, our intuitions seem to change. It wouldn't be right for the violinist to swap you out for the other person, and thereby ending your life. Um, but it seems like these two cases are sort of on a parallel. Why would you say one in the one case but not in the other? Do you think that's right, or have I expressed that correctly?
I think I understand what you're getting at. Yeah. So my view would be, let's say I'm hooked up to the violinist. I would say it's wrong for me to detach myself from the violinist at the cost of killing the violinist. And likewise, it'd be wrong for the violinist to detach herself from me at the cost of killing me. And if we're going to make it similar to abortion, it would not, detaching is actually not a very accurate word. So it's not the case in abortion that there's a kind of someone gently comes in and cuts the umbilical cord, and that the human being in utero dies of her own, underlying ailment. What really happens, if you were going to make it like the violinist case, is someone comes in and attacks the body of the violinist, chopping them up into pieces in a typical case of abortion. So I don't think that would be permissible morally either way, either for me to do that to her or for her to do that to me.
Right. Um, yeah. And then you have another complaint you have about the violence analogy is that, um, well, there are some relevant differences, potentially morally relevant difference between that case and the case of abortion. One being, well, the means by which the sort of the life is ended. In one case, I mean, it's a matter of unplugging or something like that. In the other case, it's, well, something more severe. You know, something more akin to like hacking. In some cases, um, or at least sometimes poisoning or something else like that. That could be more extreme, and also um, more the like direct result of the actions you or someone else would have to take, rather than, you know, it would be something that would just maybe happen on because of some disease or something like that. And that could be a morally relevant difference in between those cases. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So I would say that there's a morally relevant difference between intending some bad effect on the one hand versus merely foreseeing the bad effect on the other hand. So think about if you go to the dentist. If you go to a dentist, the dentist might say to you, "Hey, I'm really sorry. You've got terrible cavity, and I've got to remove the tooth. It's going to really hurt, and I'm going to do my best not to inflict any excess pain on you. But it's just the nature of the procedure. It's going to be painful." That seems like a very different dentist than a dentist who thinks to himself, "Oh, great, someone's got this cavity. I am going to inflict intentionally as much pain as I can. And I have this kind of excuse that this procedure is going to be painful, but my goal is actually to inflict the pain." And the difference is what? The difference is if you have the bad effect of pain and the doctor foresees as a regrettable side effect of the procedure that it's going to cause pain, that is not a sadistic doctor. By contrast, if the dentist is intentionally trying to inflict pain on you, that is a sadistic dentist. And this distinction between intending and foreseeing is relevant also in warfare. So think about D-Day. General Eisenhower knew for sure that some of the soldiers on the beaches of Normandy would get killed. He foresaw that. That is totally different than what Hitler did, where he ordered German troops to be shot dead. He intentionally ordered the killing of German troops should they retreat from the Russians during their attempted takeover of Russia. So to intend someone's death is a different thing than merely to foresee someone's death. So in the case of the violinist, if I detach myself from the violinist, she ends up dying of her own underlying pathology. I foresee that she's going to die if I detach myself. Whereas in the case of abortion, the abortionist is intentionally trying to bring about the death of the human being in utero. And that's why if that death does not happen, which happens rarely, it is actually a failed abortion or a botched abortion. So there are actually people alive now that the abortionist tried to kill them, and the abortionist failed in his goal. Normally, his goal to end the life of the human being in utero. And so there are cases where people have been born alive despite the the attempt of procuring an abortion. So I think that this distinction between what we intend to do on the one hand versus what we foresee to do is relevant for differentiating the violinist case on the one hand from the case of actual abortion on the other hand.
Right. Good. Yeah. And so part of what you said there, you've talked about this, which the notion of like double effect. Is that correct there? Um, I remember you brought that up in regards to um, maybe in some cases where um, to save the mother's life, or in some other kind of severe case like that where you might think that abortion is warranted. The idea is that it's warranted because it's a sort of foreseen but not intended consequence of some action that's morally permissible or correct, if that makes sense.
Exactly, exactly. So I can give a concrete case that might make it even more clear. If you have a woman who has cancer of the uterus, the doctor might come to her and say, your cancer is spreading, and the only way to save your life would be to remove the uterus and get rid of the cancer. Now, if she's also pregnant with an early term pregnancy, that removal of the uterus will also, as a side effect, end up bringing about the death of the prenatal human being. So, my view would be that if she wants to remove the uterus to save her life, that would be morally permissible. And that is not, in other words, strictly speaking, abortion, which I define as intentionally ending the life of a prenatal human being, either as a means or as an end. So, in a case like that, she would be removing the uterus to save her life. And as an unfortunate side effect of that, she foresees, but does not intend, the death of the human being in utero. Now, if on the other hand, she were to say, I already have brain cancer, I've already got lung cancer, I'm doomed to die anyway, I'm not going to remove the uterus, and I'm going to allow the pregnancy to proceed and give birth, I would say that she's not committing suicide by doing that. She foresees that not removing her uterus will shorten her life, but she's not intending to do that. She's not intending to end her life as a means or as an end. Rather, she's foreseeing that her life will end earlier than it would have otherwise. And she's doing this for a very good reason, namely that she wants to preserve the life of her son or of her daughter. So in neither case is she either getting an abortion, properly understood, or committing suicide. And you're right, this sort of reasoning is called double effect reasoning. And it's used not just in cases of pregnancy, it's used to talk about, for instance, doctors administering various medical treatments outside the context of pregnancy. It's used to talk about war ethics of war, dropping bombs on civilians and things like that. So it's used in a wide variety of circumstances, but it does apply to the case of abortion to save the life of the mother. And the basic idea is something like this, that any legitimate medical treatment that the woman would do if she were not pregnant, the woman can do in order to save her life, even if, as an unfortunate side effect of the medical treatment, it ends up that the death of the human being in utero is foreseen. Even if it's certain, that is not, properly speaking, abortion as a intentional killing as a means or as an end.
Right. That makes sense to me. I did have another question about drawing the line on personhood or the right to life, and I've heard people say things like, "Okay, maybe saying at birth is somewhat arbitrary, or picking some other time, or saying it's gradual in some way. That might be kind of arbitrary and ill motivated, but maybe so is the same for the point of conception. Why at that point rather than others? And why not earlier? There's still sperm there that have human DNA. Maybe is that why not then? Is like you're picking this point here at conception. What would you say in sort of support of picking that as the as a relevant boundary?
Yeah, so I would say that, say, a sperm and eggs are human gametes. They are parts of other human beings that give rise to a human being. So a human sperm or a human gamete is not itself a human being, but rather the elements that can give rise to a human being. So why think that the human zygote or the human fetus is a human being? Well, we can ask a prior question. Is this a living organism? Not part of an organism like a sperm or an egg, but is it a living organism? And I think the answer to that is yes. Human zygote or human fetus is a living organism. It's maintaining homeostasis. It's developing proportionally. It is on a trajectory of growth towards maturity. This is a living organism. And we recognize this in part because everybody recognizes that a human zygote or a human fetus can die. But if the human fetus or human zygote can die, well, it has to be alive first in order for the thing in question to die. Now, is it a human being? Well, I think that we can recognize that this is a human being. We could, for instance, I can't, but a scientist could differentiate a human zygote from a cow zygote, from a dog zygote. These are different species of creatures. And the same thing would be true of a human fetus as opposed to a dog fetus or a cat fetus or whatever. If you have a human man and a human woman that come together and do reproductive acts, the only kind of creature that they can bring about is a human being. You couldn't have a human being, a human man, and a human woman come together and do reproductive acts, and out comes a dog, a fish, a cow, a plant, or whatever else. It has to be a human being. You're talking about an individual that has human DNA, that's on a human trajectory of growth, etc. So then the question is, do all human beings have basic human rights? And my view is yes. I think all human beings have basic human rights. And so the human embryo, the human fetus, the human newborn, all of these are human beings. And so the human embryo, the human fetus, the human newborn all have basic human rights. And among these basic human rights is the right to live. So that's why I think that we should recognize a big difference between, say, the human zygote, the human fetus, and the human newborn on the one hand versus egg and sperm on the other hand.
Good, good. Yeah, so I mean, this is just a question that I'm not sure about. I'm sure there's certainly some discussion on this. You're saying that the gametes themselves individually are not alive, even, or is that
Well, they're
correct?
living cells, but they're not living human beings. They're part of a living human being or come from a living human being. So human beings don't have 23 chromosomes, but a sperm does and an egg cell does. So yes, it's a living cell, but it's not a living human being yet.
Oh, yeah, I did want to ask about. Um, you mentioned Judith Jarvis Thompson, and of course, she's a big figure in the history of this debate with
Yeah.
her book, "A Defensive Abortion." Is a well, it's hard to get into this topic and not reference that book. Um,
Well, it's an essay or article actually.
sorry, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, she didn't write a whole book. But David Boonin did write a whole book called A Defense of Abortion.
Oh, okay.
There's a
Maybe I'm
book called that. Yeah, there's a book called A Defense of Abortion by David Boonin, which is, I think, the best defense of the pro-choice view that I'm aware of. But then Judith Jarvis Thompson didn't write a whole book about it, but did write that famous article called A Defense of
right,
Abortion.
right. You're right. And I think, well, in that she definitely um, is it well, as I recall, pretty sure correctly, she isn't willing to grant that even if the fetus is a person, that it's always, or at least typically, wrong to kill it. Um, and so I guess this comes back to the stuff about whether persons have these rights. But I don't know, where do you think that she goes wrong in her defense of that view?
Yeah, so her view, as you said, you said correctly, she says even if the fetus is a person, that abortion is still morally permissible. And so we've already talked about this to a degree, where she talks about abortion is like being hooked up to a violinist. And we already talked about ways in which abortion really is not like being hooked up to a violinist, that in fact, I do not have serious responsibilities to provide for a random stranger violinist that I'm hooked up to. Whereas as a father, I do have serious responsibilities to care for my own biological dependent minor son or daughter. But Thompson in her article gives actually some other analogies too. She says that abortion is a little bit like a burglar who breaks into your house. And if a burglar breaks into your house, it is the burglar's a person, but we can use violence to expel the burglar from our house. And this analogy, I think, also fails. There's a huge difference between a burglar who is a guilty adult who's violating the law and who's freely choosing to come into your house, on the one hand, versus an innocent child who is not intentionally doing anything whatsoever. In the case of abortion, it is the mother and father who cause the person, and I'll say person because Thompson concedes that, causes this human person to be where it is. So it would be quite absurd if there was a child playing in front of my house. I drag the child into my house and then say, aha, you're in my house. I can expel you using violent force. That doesn't make much sense at all. So I don't think that the burglar analogy really justifies the idea that abortion is ethically permissible. And other philosophers like Marianne Warren, who was a great defender of abortion, she too recognized that Thompson's analogies, both the violinist analogy and the burglar analogy, in fact fail to justify abortion. We do not have a right to kill innocent children who we cause to be on our property.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Some people have talked about the unborn as if they're almost as if they're a sort of aggressor or something like that. Like the obviously it doesn't really make sense to say that they actually have those intents. Maybe they don't really have any intents at all. But I don't know. What do you think about this sort of language for talking about the relation between the unborn and the mother?
Well, I think you're right that it clearly is not the case that the unborn would be like an aggressor. In other words, like a criminal breaking into your house, intent on harming you, intent on stealing your goods. I mean, clearly, a fetus, a newborn baby, is not trying to harm anybody. In fact, I can hardly think of a more innocent kind of human being that's more innocent than a newborn baby or more innocent than a human being in utero. This is sort of the poster child for innocence, right? They can't have any bad intents towards anybody. And so I don't think it really works to think of this as an aggressor or as someone that's intent on causing us harm. I don't think that's really a fitting or appropriate or truthful way of describing either a newborn or a human being waiting to be born.
Good, good. That makes. I mean, yeah, it's almost as if describing it in those terms either says something false, or it's some sort of like a metaphor or analogy, which like it's not clear what that would be expressing, and it seems almost loaded in a way against the unborn, if that makes sense.
I think that's right, and unfortunately, that is a way in which some people try to defend abortion. So they'll describe the human being in utero in very dehumanizing terms. So they'll call this a parasite or an aggressor or words like that. And I do think that that is quite dehumanizing, and it's actually a strategy that's used very often for people to remove basic human dignity from a whole class of human beings, right? Where you start describing a whole class of human beings in very dehumanizing terms, calling them vermin, parasites, all these kinds of ways of talking about human beings, I think are inaccurate, untruthful, prejudicial, and lead really to an attitude of really an unfair attitude towards a whole class of human beings. So I try not to talk about any kind of human being in that kind of dehumanizing way.
Yeah, that does make me think about a problem less so in the the literature on this, but more so, I mean, still to some extent in the literature, which is that, and this can happen on both sides. Which you, on one side, you can have people framing it or using language in such a way which can lead to these sorts of effects of dehumanization. But on the other hand, you can have people really pulling on the heartstrings, trying to make it really emotional, maybe using imagery that might capture people emotionally. Um, and I mean, people can complain that either of those can be sort of illegitimate in a philosophical dispute. I don't know. What do you think about that concern about framing and presentation?
Yeah. So in my book, The Ethics of Abortion, what I try to do is use language that I intended and hoped would be satisfactory to both people that are strongly committed to abortion and people that are strongly critics of abortion. So, for instance, I'll talk about uh, critics of abortion and defenders of abortion, which is, I hope, a kind of neutral way of talking about it. And then when we talk about the human being in utero, I use often that language, a human being in utero, because I think this is scientifically accurate and a neutral, relatively neutral way of describing this. If you talk about a parasite, that seems to bias things obviously in one direction. If you talk about an unborn baby, well, that seems to bias things in the other direction. So I was trying to avoid kind of both of those extremes and talk about uh, a fetal human being or a human being in utero or fetal life, or I use different phrases that I hope, at least I'm trying to be not loading the discussion with either language that's needlessly inflammatory or language that intentionally conceals the reality. And I think this does happen in the debate. So, for instance, sometimes people talk about termination of pregnancy. Well, I think that's really a kind of term that conceals things that ought not to be concealed. It's an ambiguous term because birth terminates pregnancy, a cesarean section terminates pregnancy, a unchosen miscarriage terminates pregnancy, and an abortion terminates pregnancy. So these are all things that terminate pregnancy. So I try to be in the book more precise and accurate in the terms that I use and not use terms that needlessly inflame or conceal.
Right. That seems fair. You want to be um, accurate and sort of descriptive enough for the purposes of the discussion, but also, use as neutral a language as you can. Something that's not going to be maybe emotionally loaded one way or the other, or maybe normatively loaded one way or the other, and then go from there. That seems like the right way to go about it.
Yeah, that's what I was
Um,
trying to do. And you might say, well, calling this a human being in utero, that's loaded because, if you say a human being, people automatically think it's wrong to kill. But I think on reflection, that's not true. That's actually not true. In other words, lots of people think that there are some circumstances where it is morally permissible to kill a human being. I mean, think about in a just war. I think most people, I mean, yes, there are pacifists who say just wars don't exist. But if you think there's such a thing as a just war, you'd say, look, the Allies were killing human beings when they invaded, on D-Day in Normandy. Yeah, they were. But do I think that's justified? Yeah, I do. I think, it's too bad, it's regrettable, but it's justified in a just war to kill human beings. So I don't think we're loading, I don't think we're begging the ethical question by calling this individual or these individuals, human beings in utero. I think that's scientifically accurate. And so that's a term I often use, not always, but often.
right. Good. Um, I did want to just type something back on the stuff I was talking about earlier on some of my approaches to this, um, and then I'll ask a concluding question at the end. So yeah, so I have my own preferences or how I would prefer the what sort of abortions I would prefer, which ones I maybe wouldn't prefer, and it's kind of vague in the middle. But um, and I discussed sort of roughly the sort of considerations that um, are relevant to my judgments there. Um, it's a further question whether my preferences or judgments of that sort line up with the moral facts. Now, I struggle to understand what the objective moral facts are even supposed to mean, but it's a further concern for me. Like, okay, even if I could understand what that means and agreed that the moral facts are as diverged from my preferences in this case or other cases, it would be a further question for me why I would care about that. I mean, I might still have these same preferences, even if they don't exactly line up with the moral facts. So I guess that's my sort of main concern, I guess, to summarize, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so not knowing too much about your preferences, I wouldn't want to speculate on what those are or how those relate to this debate exactly. I guess what I would say though is something like this: that whether the pro-choice view is correct or the pro-life view is correct, either way, anyone who cares about justice should care deeply about this issue. Because if the pro-choice view is correct, it's very seriously unjust to deprive women of rights to abortion. Very seriously unjust, because a right to an abortion would be akin to a right to get a tattoo or get your ears pierced or to do anything else that's just an alteration of your body. And it would be very seriously wrong to prevent people from getting a tattoo or getting their ears pierced or whatever. I mean, maybe I personally don't want to get a tattoo, but if somebody else does, more power to them. On the other hand, if the pro-life view is correct, then it is also a matter of justice, because you're talking about the intentional killing of innocent human beings. And if that's not a matter of justice, I'm not sure what would count as a matter of justice. It seems like that is a paradigm case of justice. And one of the reasons that I hold the pro-life view is that I think there's abundant scientific evidence that there's not just one person's body involved here. There is the body of two and sometimes more than two human beings. If a woman's pregnant with twins or quadruplets, there can be more, but at least two. So, for instance, a pregnant woman has or does not have two heads, and so there's another body involved there. Often, the human being in utero has a different blood type than she has, so that's indicative of another human being involved. It can take place that the woman dies, but the baby survives. But if the baby were simply part of her body, like my hand, well, my hand doesn't just continue to survive after I die. Or it can happen that the fetus dies and the woman survives. So this is not simply just a part of her body. Otherwise, you'd have to say things like, well, half the time pregnant women have a penis. Well, no, I don't think pregnant women have a penis half the time. So you're talking really about two different human bodies. And so it is not the case that abortion is simply a matter of a woman controlling her own body. Yes, I believe in the right to control your own body, but my right to control my body stops when another person's body begins. And if we didn't recognize that principle, well, then there would be no stopping rapes or assaults or anything else, because I could just justify and say, well, I was controlling my body, so I strangled the person. Well, yeah, I can control my body, but not insofar as it impinges on somebody else's body. So insofar as we have preferences for justice, it seems like the issue of abortion is a matter of justice, regardless of whether the pro-choice view is right or the pro-life view.
Yeah, very good. That's good stuff. I mean, I could discuss this stuff all day, I guess, but I don't want to use up too much of your time. And so I do like to end with a question, kind of meta-philosophical question, which is that, well, what do you think is the value of philosophy? Why do you think it's worth doing, I guess, both for you and for society?
Well, I would say philosophy is valuable because, in fact, everyone who is an adult, mature, healthy, functioning person, in fact, does have a philosophy. And the question is whether your philosophy is going to be thought out and reflective, or whether your philosophy is just going to be adopted from watching television commercials and seeing TikTok videos and whatever. Because, in fact, everyone does, I think, have at least implicitly a philosophy. They have a view of life. They have a view about ultimate questions. And so I think it's very advantageous to have a philosophy that you've actually thought out. You've actually considered the various views on whatever matters you're talking about. And therefore, you have a philosophy that is yeah, properly critical, properly thought out, properly engaged with what other people have thought about these issues, rather than a philosophy that's just uncritically assimilated from, again, popular culture or watching TV, the internet or whatever. So I think philosophy is very, very valuable, and really valuable for everyone who doesn't want to be led around by somebody else's philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Yeah, we like these are some. Um, we have philosophies. We have views about the world and so on that are of philosophical relevance. Why don't we think about that better? Why don't we um, study that? It seems like a good view to me. Um, yeah, so I think with that, I'll end the questions there. This has been really interesting, and I really appreciate you coming on and taking my questions and discussing this stuff. It's been really great.
Great, great. Thanks for making time for me, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you and to talk about these important issues. Thanks.